So today we're going to talk about freedom in Christ and a little bit about bread. So in Galatians 5, it tells us that for freedom, Christ has set us free. We should stand firm and not be subject again to the yoke of slavery. And in the past, we've looked at a yoke, what it is. It's a piece of wood that goes over the neck of usually two animals, and so they work together, and so one of them can't go one direction and one go the other direction. So if you are yoked with Jesus, you're going in the direction that Jesus is. If you're yoked to sin, you can't go the way of Jesus and have sin go the other way. So Paul tells us here in Galatians that he wants us to be free in Christ. Now, that does not mean you can do whatever you want to do, because if you're following Christ, you need to follow what he said to do. And so in Galatians 5, verse 7, it says, "You were running well, but who prevented you from obeying the truth? This persuasion does not come from the one who calls you." So there's somebody or something out there that's trying to draw you away from Jesus. And we know from his parable of the seed and the sower that when this seed of the kingdom goes into a person, and Satan tries to steal it away, whether he just comes and takes it or the person doesn't want anything to do with it, they don't feed it and water it like we should, or maybe the cares of the world take it away because they're so concerned about what they're wearing and what they're doing. But here Paul is telling us that he uses the example of yeast or leaven. So he says a little yeast makes the whole batch of dough rise. And I know I have been making sourdough bread here for a while. And I know that when you have your starter, the yeast, you only have to put a little bit in and it makes a huge big loaf of bread. And so he's telling us that their sin can be this way. And so he says, who's confusing you? Because whoever it is, they're going to pay a penalty. But he says, brothers and sisters, please don't allow that yeast, those false teachings, to come into your life. So how does a little bit of yeast or a little bit of sin or a little bit of non-truth enter us? That yeast or that sin could come in through our eyes by if we're watching things or if we're reading things. It can come in through our ears if we're listening to music or things like that. And so when we let a little bit of that in, we might think at the beginning, oh, it's just a little bit, it's not that bad. But Paul is telling us that yeast, that sin, can make the whole batch rise, and that can make everything then turn bad inside of you if you allow that in. So we need to be really careful about that. If you'd really like to, I would encourage you to maybe make some sourdough starter and start making some bread. It might teach you a few things, and you'll have some really good bread. But if you would, please, next time you eat some bread, consider the yeast that goes into that bread to make that bread rise. If you're eating a loaf of bread, not a little thin cracker, and how it makes it get that way. And you don't need a lot of it again. If you go to the store, you can find packs of yeast. They're just tiny little packages that are maybe a tablespoon of yeast. And you put that in to make a lot of pizza dough. And so that's the same thing we need to remember with sin. A little bit of sin can come into us and create havoc in our life. It can lead us down really bad roads. And if we let that little bit in, it's going to grow and it's going to become more and more and more. You're going to want to watch more of that. You're going to want to listen to more of that, read more of that, do more of whatever that is. And it's going to grow. That's just a fact of how yeast works, and sin works in that same way. And so I encourage you to consider that and to remember that when you know you're listening to something or reading something or watching something that maybe isn't the best thing. My question that I always ask is, would Jesus watch it? Would Jesus listen to it? Would Jesus do it? And if the answer is no, then we probably shouldn't either. And so then that would become that little bit of yeast. So everything you're doing, think of it as yeast. Everything you watch, the TV show that you watch, is a little bit of yeast. Is it going to be good yeast or bad yeast? What kind of bread are you going to get? Are you going to get a loaf of bread that is full of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Or are you going to get a loaf of bread that is full of sin and wickedness, and that's going to lead you to disobey Jesus and to be a moldy, bad loaf of bread? We want to have the good bread. Jesus even calls himself the bread of life. And so if we want life, we want his bread. If we want to have good bread, we have to have the good yeast, not the bad yeast. And so I encourage you to think of that every time you're putting something in front of you, that you're putting your headset on and listening to, every channel you turn to, every movie you go watch, the things that you do, consider it yeast and ask yourself, am I going to get a moldy loaf of bread, or am I going to get a loaf of bread that brings life like Jesus? So it's a very simple lesson today, and hopefully that it encourages you to make sure you're not putting bad yeast in, but just the good yeast. So have a blessed day and be a nice, good loaf of bread. Yes, I realize yeast does not make bread moldy or good. The point is, yeast makes the loaf grow. So if you are putting bad things in, you are going to grow bad habits and be a bad loaf, and it's just going to grow and grow. If you put in good, godly things, you will grow a good life and a life that is pleasing to God.